So, episode 5, character design. And this episode will be covering the character design process of Danica, who, to those who have been following this series so far, should know by now, know is the protagonist of this little short film. And to all of you out there who are horror freaks and geeks like myself, she is what you would call the final girl character in a slasher flick. She's someone who barely makes it out alive at the end. Or not. There will be a collective of episodes covering each, maybe not each, design of the characters in this short. And Danica being the lead in this story, it just made sense to begin this character design segment with her. Let's just have a look at where we are so far in the animation pipeline. So, like I had covered before in episode 3, very briefly, here are all the steps involved with the animation pipeline that I have divided into different stages. So the first stage highlighted in green is the pre-production stage, which is where we are currently at right now in the series, which consists of the scripts, thumbnails, the storyboard and the edits, and the keyframes and designs. Then we have the production stage, which consists of layouts and animation assist. And finally, we have post-production, which consists of compositing, color correction, and the final film. There are also other components that I didn't add in there, which are sound design, sound mixing, score, and a final sound mix before ending up with a finished film. The longest time that will be spent within this pipeline is the animation assist stage. That's the biggest hurdle here. So just to put it into perspective with how far in the pipeline we are in this series, we are at this stage here right now, which is the final stage of the pre-production stage. So we're almost there and landing our feet on the starting point of this big hill we are going to climb up here pretty soon. But let's not dwell on that just yet. So in today's episode, we're going to be covering this part of the pipeline, which is the keyframes and designs. More specifically, the design parts. So I'm going to be covering with you taking the conceptual design of one of my characters, that character being Danica, and refining it to a stage that is passable and animatable for 2D animation. And I'm going to show you my methodology of how I do what's known as a turnaround. So here is my conceptual design of Danica, back when I was putting together a pitch bible for the feature, Flesh of the Dead, over 2 years ago now. Back when I was having discussions with some producers about getting it made and making it my directorial debut. I've discussed this in depth already back in my first 2 episodes I did, so I don't think I need to go on as far about it from here. So I have a character's name and a little description that cover an idea of her personality, what her relationship is to the other cast of characters in the film. I have here an artboard. This is where a character design's process begins. Before you venture off into doing the fun stuff, you need to do a bit of research on the internet and find some sources of inspiration relating to the job description. Anything that resembles or encapsulates the essence of who the character is that you can use to help give you possibilities of what the character could look like as you begin going through the process of roughing out drawings of the character until you produce a design that is considered acceptable for animation use before taking it through the turnaround stage. There's also a body and facial pose component in the character design process, but this will be covered in the keyframing stage, as I'll be using a methodology that kind of cuts out the middleman, you could say, and combines the character design process with the first stage of blocking the animation process. To think that I can go through the traditional routes of the considered process of character design will just add an unnecessary workload for one person carrying the production, and instead going for an approach that suits for a one-man production and still getting the same results needed to help me as I continue into the various stages that lie ahead of me. As the saying goes, doing more with less. So keep that in mind, that this method is suited for my needs as well as helpful to anyone going on a similar endeavor. It's not a method that is necessary for if you were working on a production that has a team of artistic talents with a decent budget behind it. So moving along, I revisited my artboard and my conceptual design and did a slew of bad drawings on paper until I found a drawing that I was overall happy with, taken forward and refined in Procreate. So, like I did in my storyboarding process, I scanned my drawing and then imported it into Procreate. Then I just add another layer atop of the scan, lower the opacity by half, And then I draw over the rough line work and refine it, like so. In case you haven't noticed, Danica has a very gothic dress sense, a bit punky. Which is a trait that Jackson jokes about. She's very introverted, so she has these big Simpson-esque eyes, but a small nose and mouth. She's pretty skinny and has a very tiny stature, just utilizing the shape language in her design that best represents the character's personality as described in the Pitch Bible. Then I'm going to create individual layers beneath the layer with the refined line work. For the colours, I'll apply to the character's skin tone and her attire. As you can see, I'm staying true to the conceptual design, but just simplifying the shapes and reducing the pencil mileage in the line work. These are some key words to keep a mental note of. Pencil mileage especially, because when you are designing a character for a frame-by-frame 2D animated piece, you have to consider how many lines it takes to draw a complete character, because that has to be redrawn every 24 frames a second, or if it's for a 2D animated series on a tight deadline, it will most likely be animated on 2s to cut costs so that the animators can deliver to a deadline. So what do I mean by animated on 2s? Like I said before, if you're drawing every 24 frames per second, that's called animating on 1s. So animating on 2s is halving the amount of work for an animator. So instead of drawing every 24 frames per second on 1s, on 2s you are drawing every 12 frames per second. So that's my 2 cents to any beginners out there who are thinking of delving into animation. You know, limited animation, which is very much the type of animation that I'm most likely going to be achieving, which you will see in later episodes. There will also be a methodology that I've put into practice in how I animate 2D pieces of artwork, which skips the unnecessary amount of work in the various stages of traditional 2D animation. That saves a lot of faff. And it's a pretty cool method actually, if I don't say so myself. So I like to maintain some of the rough line work from my original drawing. I like a more imperfect, crunchy analog look, you know, just that homemade feel that I think adds to that grimy, low budget horror aesthetic to it. There's a logical reason behind this approach. One obvious reason is something that is achievable and less tedious for one person to handle. Another, and a much simpler reason, is just personal taste. Okay, so this design is at a stage I would say is a considered design for 2D animation. Just going to compare this new drawing with the original conceptual design. So here's how it looked before, and this is how it looked after. Before and after. And I can honestly say I like the after more than the before. So now we're going to turn this one drawing into a few to create a turnaround. Now, typically in an ideal world, as a character designer, you would draw over the line work and repose where the character is facing. But I have found and learnt a method where you can get the same results by utilizing one drawing throughout. And to do that is to duplicate and cut pieces of the artwork and warp areas to move them around. And with enough fiddling, you will see a complete turnaround by doing this process. So I'm just going to go to the top left here, and then I'm going to go to this tool here called the freehand tool. And I'm going to slice this drawing in half, get rid of it. Then I'm just going to cut around the eye and move it slightly to the left, move the pupil, cut around her nose, move that further in front of where her eye is now facing, cut around her jawline, and I'm just going to warp it to make it look like her head has fully turned facing right, or screen left from where we are looking. Cut around her fringe and move it to where she is facing, reposition her crown slightly, and just do a bit of cutting and warping with her hair from behind, fix some of the line work. And I'm going to use an eyedropper tool to fill in the blank areas from where I have removed pieces of the artwork. To do that is you just press and hold down your index finger on the area of your artwork, and Procreate will select the matching color you want to use to fill in those blank areas. Pretty simple. Going to cut around her arm and move it to the center. Going to cut around her hand. And I'm going to cut and move the positions of her fingers and the back of her palm, and just repositioning the pieces to make it look like we have the back of her hand now facing us. The same with her leg and her foot. I'm going to flip it, cut around the foot area here, and move and warp it so it looks like it is facing where the rest of Danica's body is now facing. Just going to fix some areas of the line work and use the eyedropper tool to fill in any blank areas created in my artwork after moving some of the pieces about. Then I'm going to duplicate this layer and erase the duplicated drawing and only leave her leg and place it behind the leg in front. Because in her pose, when she is facing in her 3/4 angle, her right leg is slightly relaxed. It's where she is resting her weight on it. So I need to keep that consistent in the turnaround. And from this position, you would see some leg slightly behind the one that is in front and an area of her boot. I like to go back and forth between this pose of her facing screen left to the first 3/4 angle drawing, just so their positions are aligned with each other, and to see if the areas of the drawing in the duplicated layer I've moved need to be repositioned slightly back or forward, or warping areas to match the proportions. This is the fiddly part of the process of my methodology here. It takes a bit of trial and error until all the repositioned pieces of the artwork is aligned and makes sense with the turnaround. And as you see as we time-lapse through this, I keep going back and forth between the layers and cut and warp and fix the line work, and I keep working on it until it is at a place where the transitioning looks like it's working. Another part of this method, which saves a lot of time, is now that I cut and morphed the drawing in 2 of its positions of the turnaround, I'm going to duplicate the 3/4 angle drawing and the second position where she is facing screen left, and I'm going to flip them, and now I have 2 new drawings here in her 3/4 angle facing the other way, and the duplicated drawing of her facing left now facing right. And that is going to save me a lot of time and get into a finished turnaround much sooner than if I were to do a turnaround the more traditional way. Just going to flip back and forth between these layers and align them to smooth the transitions of these layers in the turnaround. Do a bit of tweaking here and there, just going back and forth, adding clarity and making the animation in the turnaround smoother. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and duplicate one of the 3/4 angle drawings, and I'm going to slice it in half and erase one of the halves. Then I'm going to duplicate the remaining half and flip it, just going to align it and have the 2 halves facing each other. Then I'm going to merge these 2 layers, and then I'm going to gradually cut around and move, warp, and connect these 2 halves together. And as you can see, I'm creating how Danica looks when facing towards us, standing in a frontal position. Moving these eyes slightly closer into each other, tweak her crown, move and warp her jawline a bit. And I'm just going to keep on moving parts of the artwork in until the proportions feel and look right. There's not much more to explain here that I had already mentioned, just constantly tweaking and going back and forth between the layers of the process of making a turnaround. Duplicate a layer, erase it, and keep the leg that is bent and replace the left leg that is straight here, just keeping the areas of the pose consistent throughout. Cut around and reposition the heels of her boots so it looks like it is facing more towards us. Trying to get the crown of her head right. Trying to find a middle ground of the proportion of it that feels right when matching it with the rest of the layers of the turnaround here. Fix the line work here, use the eyedropper tool and fill in these blank areas here. So now I've done her standing in her frontal position. Now the next position I'm going to go from here is having her facing her back to us. So I'm going to completely cover her face in black and connecting where the journey of where the length of her hair ends. And now it looks like her head is completely turned facing away from us. Now, I'm just going to cut and warp her chest area, going to move and redraw areas of her fingers and her palms, and I'm going to erase some areas of her hands, and it looks like that parts of her fingers are resting by her sides. Cut and move the heels of her feet in, draw lines down here, and it looks like her feet are facing where the rest of the body is now facing in this layer. Colour over this belt buckle. Just going to add a line and pockets here for the back of her shorts. Just going to adjust these lines where the journey of her legs begins, and some butt cheek here, some fixing here and there. Now, there's just 2 more positions in this turnaround, which is Danica in a 3/4 angle facing away looking towards her left and towards her right. So this is like how I approach Danica's back position of the turnaround, but I'm just going to move her nose and have it sticking out of her cheek here. Move her eye just behind the nose and the pupil looking where the nose is positioned. But I'm going to fill in all this area of her face in black. This is of course the back of her head. Now I'm going to move her whole arm across to the other side of her torso, flip it, and just going to adjust her fingers and the back of her hand so it's angled in a way that we are seeing her hand from a side, the way it would look like if we saw someone standing from this angle. I'm just going to break this artwork apart, disconnect the head from the neck, the torso from where the belt is, then disconnect the belt from her hips. Adjust her heels and move them in a position where they would be facing from this angle. Get rid of some details here on her boots. Reposition these legs slightly to align them where they are positioned in the other layers in this turnaround. Move the bent knee pose here so it makes sense in the turnaround. Fix some of the line work. Just going to go back and forth and keep on tweaking this. Okay, and now I'm finished with this layer. I only have one more layer to do in this turnaround, and that is the 3/4 angle of her facing away but towards screen right. And all I need to do to achieve this is duplicate this layer and flip it. And there we have a 3/4 angle of Danica facing away towards screen right. Just going to swap her bent knee around with her leg standing straight, since the bent knee will now be more in front from this angle. Do a bit of fixing. Just going to scroll back and forth on the timeline to see how the turnaround looks. I'm using an animation timeline to help me see how the turnaround is looking. So to turn on your animation timeline in Procreate, you need to go to this spanner logo here, go to Canvas, and it gives you an option here to turn on what says Animation Assist. It will open the animation timeline. It lines up your layers as frames and play back your animation in real time. That's fine. I can see where I need to do more tweaking. The turnaround is a bit jittery, so I need to continue to make alterations here. So from here, I'm just going to be tweaking the fuck out of this until I'm pretty much satisfied with the end result. So I'm just going to time-lapse to the end of this. So now we have a turnaround. We've taken a concept drawing and simplified the design, reworked it, and have undergone my methodology of creating a full turnaround of a character design by duplicating, cutting, and warping one drawing. It's a bit of a fiddly process, but as you keep working on it and observe it, you find a flow, and you can achieve an effective turnaround without having to go through the faff of having to redraw it over and over, and then applying the colors over and over. This method just condenses the process and takes up less of your time to complete a full character design and turnaround. Like I said earlier, it just works for this kind of production where it's just one person running the entire thing. So this pretty much covers what I wanted to go over with you in this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching me go through the process of my approach to character design as much as I enjoyed making it. In the next episode, we will go over another character design, this time with Jackson, who is the character I voice in the shorts. So until then, I'll see you in episode 6. Same bloody time, same bloody channel.